I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome to the Great Gift Sew-Along. We wanted to get crafty with you as the holiday season approaches, so I've put together the best of our best patterns for you to make handcrafted gifts for your loved ones with ease and joy. We'll be making Perfect Pouches by Lazy Girl Designs, Rock Candy Table Topper by Jaybird Quilts, Sweetpea Pods by Lazy Girl Designs, and finishing up with Candy Dish Pillows by Jaybird Quilts. Welcome back to the Rock Candy Table Topper. Now that we have pieced our topper, it's time to work on quilting. Make sure to sign up to receive the sew-along emails and the worksheets, including the quilting worksheet, at the link posted in the video description below. Let's get started. So the first step in quilting is to decide how you're going to quilt it. Many of my Rock Candy Table Toppers have been professionally long arm quilted. I know it's not that practical to send something of this size to a long arm quilter. I'm often sending a few of them at a time along with some pillows, so it makes sense to do them all on one backing. But for today's example, I'm going to go ahead and quilt this on my regular machine with a walking foot so that you can see it's just as amazing done at home. So first step is to go ahead and make my sandwich. I need my quilt top, my batting, and my backing. I've chosen to use a scrap from my Nebula quilt and a scrap of batting. You just need a piece of each one that are larger than your Rock Candy topper. I've kind of trimmed these just because I was cutting from some weird scraps, but it doesn't matter if yours are larger. You'll trim that all down after you're finished quilting. So the next step is to pin it together. And I have these curved safety pins, had these for a long time, that I use when basting something here at home. Depending on the size of your project is going to determine how many pins you want to use. Obviously, if you are making a large quilt, you will want to use more pins than if you're just making a small table topper like this. And if you know your pattern that you want to quilt, I would suggest to go ahead and place the pins not in the way of your first few lines of quilting. So I know that the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna quilt on either side of these lines. So that's why I'm making sure that I'm putting my pins not in the way of those lines. So I'm just gonna put some pins in here. All right, I've got all my pins in. And I should mention that you can also free motion this on a standard home machine. That's just not really my expertise in my wheelhouse. When I do quilting here at home, I prefer to use my walking foot and do straight line quilting. Both are completely good options. If you're comfortable doing free motion quilting on your home machine, I encourage you to go for it. So now that I have it basted, my next step is to figure out my thread. And I could do 6 different threads, but I really don't want to be playing around with thread changes for a project that is this small. So I took out a couple options, this like lilac and this variegated yellowy orange and this pale pink. And I laid them on all the different colors, and I decided that I think this pale pink is what is going to blend in best. It'll definitely pop on the darker colors, but it'll blend in most of the place, and I kind of want the piecing to be the star, not the quilting. So I'm gonna go with this. It is Aurifil 2423, if you're interested in using the same one. I am now over at my machine, and I've gotten my light pink thread loaded, and I have my walking foot on. And I will give you a diagram of what I end up doing in this week's email. So if you're watching this video and you were not signed up, go ahead and sign up for the sew along so that you can get the diagram. But I will show you what I end up doing. I think what I'm gonna do is, as I said, I'm gonna do lines for these 6 to start, and then we'll see where I go from there. So I often use piecing as my landmarks. Since I press my seams open, I don't stitch in the ditch. I also just don't tend to find that to be the most attractive personally. So I will, in this case, I'm gonna start close to a corner. And I'm just gonna do a little bit just to get my thread started and kind of tack that down. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my foot as a guide. So I'm gonna end up being, it looks like maybe about 3/8 of an inch It's a little more generous than a quarter, away from this seam. You can do a quarter, you can do whatever. I like to use my foot as a guide because the foot is consistent, and then I can just continue following along. So I'm going to use the inside part of my foot here as a guide and stitch all along this line through my table topper. Now it's important that you're using a walking foot here because the first time I went ahead and did quilting like this, I didn't know any better, and so I didn't use a walking foot, and things will bunch without a walking foot. So what the walking foot does is it evenly moves the fabric on the top and the bottom at the same time. They both now have feed dogs. If you only have feed dogs on the bottom and nothing on the top, things are going to pull unevenly and you're going to end up with some unattractive puckers. And I think I just did that with 2.5, and I think I'm going to change it to 3. It might bother some people to have different stitch lengths in the quilting on the same project. It won't bother me, but I want to go ahead and switch that to 3 for my future lines of sewing. So I'm going to now repeat that line back on the pink side of the line and go back to the corner where I started. And now I'm back at this corner. If you pieced your rock candy the way the pattern is written, you do not have this diagonal seam here. So if you want to quilt it similar to how I'm quilting it now, I suggest getting a chalk marker or a slight pencil, something that you can see depending on the background color that you use that you can erase later, and draw that diagonal line so that you have that as a guide. So I have 2 choices now. I can start and stop my stitching and move on to another side, or I can use this as an opportunity to baste along one side. So I'm going to increase my stitch length and do that, which will help me later on when I go to put my binding on, keep everything together. Okay, and now that I'm at this corner, I want to make sure I go back to my correct stitch length. I have done that before where I forget and then I have giant stitches going all the way along my quilt. And I'm going to repeat that process with the guide of my foot to do the straight lines across here as well. And now I'm back at that corner, and I'm gonna switch back to my longer stitch length again and baste in my next corner. And then I'm gonna go ahead and sew my last 2 straight lines. I've now sewn my 6 straight lines that intersect, kind of intersect in my center, and I'm going to take this opportunity to baste around my remaining 4 edges. I'm now going to remove my project and assess and decide where I'm going to quilt next. So I now have those 6 lines, 2 in every direction. And depending on what batting you are using, that is probably enough or close to enough according to the standards of how far apart you can quilt. But just because you can leave it that lightly quilted doesn't mean that's what you want. Maybe it is, and you can go ahead and be done, but maybe you want something a little more dense. There's so many possibilities. So I am going to remove my pins at this point because I feel like I have enough stitching to hold everything in place. So I have lots of options here. I have thought about doing the same lines through all of the points. That would be very densely quilted. I've thought about going along the tops. What I think that I have decided is I'm gonna kind of echo the V that the lines created by adding some quilting here. I want some guidelines for myself, so I'm gonna go ahead and create them with a ruler and a chalk marker. I'm just going to simply line this up, and that will give me the guide to go under my foot as if there was piecing there. So I'm going to repeat and make those 2 lines all the way around my rock candy. Now that I have all of my lines drawn, I'm going to head back over to the machine and do that same echo stitching on the inside of each of these V's. Here's what that's going to look like. And I'm going to use that line that I drew with my chalk as if it's a stitching line. Oh, and I made that mistake that I said I might make, which is my stitch length is still super long. So I'm going to go ahead and unpick this, and I'll be back in just a second. Took that out. Let's try this again. Got my stitch length set. Gonna double check that now. I'm gonna go slow as I get to the center, and I'm gonna eyeball where I think the middle of my diamond is. And I did pretty good. I'm gonna turn and come back out. Now I'm just gonna travel around to my next point. And continue this process all the way around my table topper. I've now completed all of the quilting that I am going to do on my rock candy. So the next step is to trim my excess batting and backing before I start my binding. And I am simply going to use a straight ruler and line it up on the edge of my piece. And I did that basting when I was doing my quilting, so things will hold together. I highly suggest doing that, especially if your quilting itself does not go all the way to the edge. And cut. And I'm just gonna turn and cut each side until my table topper is all cut out. I now have trimmed off all of my excess, and it's time to bind my topper. And with using 6 different background fabrics, I really wasn't sure what binding I wanted to use so that it didn't take away from that. So I have a stash of leftover bindings from other projects, and I kind of took some out and auditioned. And I realized that this binding that I made last week for my Nebula lap size quilt actually kind of pulls from the hexagons, and because it has the rainbow, is going to be a nice perfect finish without taking away from my color wheel. So since I already have this made, I'm just going to go ahead and use this to bind my rock candy table topper. I'm now ready to put the binding on my rock candy table topper. In general, we want to avoid having our seams end up at the corners of our quilt, and that can be hard when you're doing a large quilt to kind of plan out where they're going to be. But when you're working on something this small, what I often do is I will lay my binding out and make sure that all of my seams will land on a side and not at a corner. About 1 inch away is the closest I'd like to get. So I kind of auditioned my binding in place, and I'll adjust it a little bit right left as needed to make sure that I don't end up with one of those exactly at my corner. So once I have that taken care of, it's time to sew my binding into place. And similar rules that we use with any other binding, which is we want to have a tail. Now, because of the length of the rock candy sides, we can't really have an 8 to 10 inch tail. So I'm shooting more here for probably like a 6 inch, and then I can adjust once I get my all the way around. So I'm just going to start about 1 inch away from a corner so that I leave as much tail as I can. And I'm going to sew till I get to this seam, which if you used different background fabrics like mine, you'll see, but if you used one, you won't see this line. But that's kind of my guide. It's 1/4 of an inch before I get to this side. So I'll show you what that looks like. And I'm going to just backstitch a little bit, and then I'm going to leave my threads attached. And normally if this was square, I would fold it 90 degrees and then 90 degrees. But because it's a hexagon, I need to do something a little bit differently, which is I want to go away from where I'm going. So I actually want to fold it up like this, along there. But specifically what you're looking for is that this is a straight line. So you're folding it away from where you're going next. So up here, and then I'm going to fold it back onto my piece. And you'll notice that you have less fabric here in your miter than you're probably used to for a 90 degree. That is correct. That's what you need for a 60 degree miter. Be good if my sewing machine was in forward and not reverse. All right, so I'm just going to continue sewing my binding on. And I'm going to repeat those same steps at this corner, so till I get to 1/4 of an inch. And if anything, you want to go too short here instead of too long. So more like 3/8, not 1/8, because if you go too long, you can't have a proper miter. If you go too short, what you can still do is fold this properly. So I went too short here to show you, so I should have sewn all the way till where my yellow and my green meet. But what I can do is pull this in place, and this next stitching will hold that corner in place. So if I'm up here and I would fold, that would be way too much here. But if I went too far, I can't compensate. So if you go a little too short, what you do is just use your finger to just roll it to where you should have sewn. And you only want to do this by a stitch or two, not more than that, because then your corner will get loose. Fold it back to where it's going to go. Turn and continue stitching, and then repeat this process in every corner until we get back to our first tail that we started with. I'm now coming to my last corner, and I highly recommend you take your time doing these corners. Taking your time in making each of these miters on the front is really what's going to yield that good looking corner on the front and on the back with the miter. So taking your time here is well worth it in the long run. Again, I'm just going to stitch till I get to that 1/4 inch, back stitch a little bit, fold up and away from where I'm going, and then back down. Gonna check my miter, make sure I'm in good shape. And now I'm only going to sew about 1 inch, and then I'm going to take my piece off. Now that I have finished sewing this on, I need to go ahead and figure out where to cut this tail to match up with this one so that I have a perfect loop and you can't tell where I put my seam. I have an extra long tail on the end because I'm using leftover binding. You might have less, but what you're going to do is take your piece that you just finished with and lay it along the edge, raw edge to raw edge, and open it up. And then lay your starting tail on top of it. And just take a pencil and mark where they meet up. I flipped my piece over so that it's easier to open this up and see my drawn line. So here is my drawn line, and normally I would add 1/2 inch to this, but because I have bias and it's going to stretch, I'm going to add a little bit less than 1/2 inch. I want to make sure that I don't end up with too much binding that would bubble. If I was doing straight of grain, I would add just 1/2 inch, not a little bit scant of 1/2 inch. But I'm going to go a little bit scant of my 1/2 inch, and I'm going to draw my line over here. And that's where I need to go ahead and cut so that I have enough seam allowance to join my two pieces. You can cut this with scissors or with a rotary cutter. If you're using a rotary cutter, be careful that you don't cut your table topper because you are working very close to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this. I'm now going to work on joining these two pieces, and I want to make sure that I don't twist either one. I want to make sure that I put them together properly. So I'm going to open them both up and I'm going to kind of pull my table topper like this so that I have room to sew these together, and I'm going to sew these together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to kind of fold them out of fold my table topper out of the way. And I am going to backstitch here just because I'm not chain piecing and I don't want these threads to come out. And there we go. And what I'm just going to do here now is I'm going to finger press this open. You could use your iron, but I don't have my iron turned on, and I don't know that I would turn my iron on for something this small. If I didn't have it on, I could also use my seam roller. Grab my seam roller, get that nice and rolled flat, and then I'm going to fold this back on itself and use my seam roller to roll it in place. And now I'm just going to sew that remaining section onto my table topper and trim my little dog ears off. Now that I have my binding onto my table topper, the next step is to finish my binding. And here I have two choices. I can do this by hand or by machine. I love doing hand binding, but I will frequently do machine if it is something that I need done fast, something that I think is going to be washed a lot, or something that I just don't have the time to do the hand sewing. Hand sewing is much more of a slower meditative process, but I do love doing it. So I'm going to show you how to do the hand work. If you'd like to see how I do my binding by machine, I did that recently with my Nebula quilt, and there's a link below. So what we need to do now that it's sewn onto the front is wrap it to the back. And I will always start on a straight side, and I use Wonder Clips, and I will clip towards the corners, and then I will do the corners after a little bit of my straight sides are clipped, and that way I can get the best possible miter. So let's just put a couple more in. And I don't really care if the clips are up or if they're down. Some people have a preference. I don't. If you are using them to measure, they have marks on the clear side, then use that side where you need to measure them if you're using them for a different project. So now I have these straight sides, and I'm going to go ahead and clip my corner. And what I want to do is I want to look at the front, and I want to pull it a little taut. Not super tight, but I want to kind of pull that miter out. And I want to split my bulk. So if you look on the front, all my bulk is here on the left. And what I mean by the bulk is the bulk of the miter. So there's less layers here. There's a lot more layers here. And I don't want the bulk on the back to be on the same side. Because if I wrapped this one first and then this one, if you look from like straight overhead, all this bulk is on the left. There's no bulk on the right. So you want to always wrap where your bulk is first. So in this case, that's this side. I'm going to put a clip close to the corner. And then I want to wrap this side. And I want to be looking at the back while I do it. When you have a 90-degree corner, you do a full tuck of your binding to get that good miter. But if you do a full tuck at a 60, you're going to end up with this strange angle and this missing little triangle. So you only want to do a partial tuck. It's basically the same amount that you actually did on the front, so that this creates a nice perfect Y. And put another clip, and then I'm going to turn it back to the front to check, and that looks great. And what I mean by the split the bulk is, if you can see, all my bulk on the front is over here and all my bulk on the back is over here. So it makes for a smoother corner. And so I will repeat that process all the way around until I have all of my binding clipped. The next step is the hand sewing. And generally speaking, I would use a thread that matches my binding. This is 2600, which is my favorite. Aurifil gray happens to match this binding. But for today's demonstration, so you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to use black, and then I'm going to take this out when I am done showing you what I'm doing. So I will usually pull off 18 to 20 inches. I try not to go too much longer. It's tempting, but it will often turn into a knot and get tangled, and that's the last thing we want to be dealing with. Now, when it comes to needles, it's a very personal preference. Most people I have found bind with a short needle with a small eye. I am apparently not most people. And I like to bind with a really long needle. This one happens to be curved. Not that it came that way, it just has bent over time. And I love this needle. This specific one, I've bound so many quilts, it's not even that sharp anymore. I don't recommend doing things like this, but you know, we all have those things that we do that are not what we would actually recommend. And this is my favorite go-to binding needle. So go ahead and thread your needle. And then we need to knot one end of this, and you could just tie a knot the way we've all been taught to tie a knot. But I learned one time on the Bust to a Quilt show a quilter's knot. So in case you don't know what a quilter's knot is, here's a little tip for the day. So take your needle in your one hand and your tail end of your thread in your other hand and place it across your needle, like a cross, and hold it with the thumb that was already holding the needle. And then twist it around like 3 or 4 times. Then switch hands to hold what you've twisted with your other hand and pull down. And like magic, you have a knot. Who knew? It's kind of fun. So now that I have my knot, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And one thing I've also discovered when teaching is that some people bind right to left and some people bind left to right. I don't think there's actually a correct or an incorrect way. Whichever way feels more comfortable to you, go ahead and do. I bind from right to left, and interestingly, I bind away from myself. So I bind up, which I haven't seen many people do this. It's just how I learned, and it's what's most comfortable for me. I can bind in this direction, but I'm most comfortable going this direction. So I'll kind of show you both. So what I will do, since I have it knotted, is I'll usually do a stitch or two into my entire piece, but I'll make sure it doesn't come to the front, just to kind of get it started. And then I'll make sure I tuck that tail in. Move that pin out of the way that clip out of the way if I need to. Okay. And then what you want to do is you want to go into your piece the length of your stitch. This is a really long one. And then up into the very end of your binding. You don't want to take a big bite of your binding. You don't want to just take one thread like that. That'd be too little. You want to kind of go just into it, but enough. But you want to have a shorter stitch than that. So we're going to go down and up and pull our thread through. And basically, we want to see as little of this stitching as possible. So even in my black, you can barely see it. But if it was gray, you wouldn't see it at all. And you want to just continue around taking little bites. And now sometimes I will do 2 or 3 stitches and then pull, but you got to make sure you don't get your thread tangled anywhere if you do, 2 or 3 and then pull. But like I said, I bind away from me, so this is what it looks like when I'm binding. And I don't use a thimble to push my needle through. It's probably because I have a long needle. If you have a short needle, you might need a thimble. And I keep my finger of my other hand on the bottom to make sure I'm not going too deep. So I'll show you too deep so you can see what that looks like. So if I go too deep right here, I'm poking this finger. And if I didn't catch that too deep, you can see on the other side, you can see my needle, which means after I pull my thread through, you can see my thread. And we've all had this happen. Sometimes it still happens to me, even with my finger underneath. Hopefully, if it happens, you catch it soon enough to fix it, or your thread blends in to where it happened. Obviously, this does not blend at all, but I'm going to be taking it out. But having your finger under here is a good way to kind of like, if you poke your finger a little bit, then you know you went too deep. What you ideally want to do is you want to go through the backing and through the batting, but not the front. If you just go through the backing, if you go too shallow, this stitching is not as strong and might not hold up as well over time. So you do want to get some chunk of the batting there, a little bit of meat, so to say, and come up. And then just meditatively work your way around while you're binging some show maybe, or watching Tula's Tuesday video, or catching up on one of the Nebula videos. So I will work my way all the way around, and then when I run out of thread, so pretend this is the end, I'll usually do a couple stitches into my piece again and go like this, tie a knot, make sure it's nice and secure. And then depending on how long of a tail it is, I'll tuck that tail in. No point in cutting it, just kind of leave it in there. And then when I get back to the end, I will usually overlap. So when I get back to here, I'll usually overlap about 1 inch of my stitching. And then I will just do some long stitches right behind all of them, like this, to bury my thread. I'll do that for a few more inches, and then I will cut the rest of my thread off. So I hope this information helps you finish your rock candy table topper. I'm going to go ahead and take this black thread out and use my gray thread to finish mine up. I have completed the hand sewing of my binding to the back of my rock candy table topper. My project is now finished, so I can go ahead and start using it. Thank you for tuning in today. If this video was helpful for you, please like it, share your comments with us, and click here to subscribe to this channel. Here are links to the other great gift sew-along videos and some of my other videos you might like. Sign up to receive the sew-along emails and worksheets at the link posted in the video description below. In the next video, we're going to work on making sweet pea pods. See you soon!